I have been wanting to add dovetails to my work for quite a while, but my woodworking skills are not at the point where I can hand cut these. So I decided to buy myself a jig. Being the kind of cheapskate who buys the least expensive tool that they can find only to buy a much more expensive one later, I went and got this $45 jig on Amazon. And then because I'm a moron, or possibly a masochist, or maybe a little bit of both, I got this $40 jig from Harbor Freight. Now, initially, I was going to do a compare and contrast and talk about the two of them, but despite the fact that these tools do exactly the same thing, they are very different tools. So we'll talk about this one later, maybe in another video. In this video, I'm going to talk about the General Tools Jig. Hello and welcome to my channel. A lot of content creators will make you sit till the end of the video to reveal their final decision or opinion on the tool. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tell you right up front. This is the General Tools Dovetail Jig. I got it off Amazon for about 45 bucks, and I think it's a decent tool for the money. It definitely has some shortcomings and limitations. It also has some interesting versatility, but ultimately you can use it to cut serviceable dovetails. Those are decent. Nothing wrong with those. And in the end, isn't that what really matters? That a tool does what it's supposed to do. I did find the directions a little confusing. So at the end of this video, instead of giving you my final opinion, I'm going to do a little short tutorial on how to use this to cut the dovetails. So let's talk about what this tool can and cannot do and where I think it's lacking. As you can see, I've been doing a lot of practicing with this. So let's talk about what this tool can and can't do. You can use this tool to make half-blind dovetails. You can use it to make end panel dovetails. And you can use it to make box joints. Please ignore how sloppy this is. That's my fault, not the jig's fault. The only bit I had for cutting these was, as you can see, really tall. So I have to cut those down, and I was a little sloppy like here with how I was working. That's my fault. That's not the jig's fault. What you cannot do, even though they say you can do it, is cut through dovetails. And I'll explain to you exactly why. There's a couple of reasons. First of all, you end up with this rounded shape, which really doesn't look good, and there's no way to avoid that. This is the finger for the tail side of the jig. And this is not a full hemisphere shape here. What you have is a square with radiuses on the corner. So you end up with rounded corners. So instead of getting a properly round radius, you actually get a radius with a little flat on the bottom, which leaves you with these little gaps here underneath. And I mean, it's an appearance thing. I suppose if you're okay with that, you're okay with that. But I don't think it looks really good. And there's another issue with this too. In that if you are trying to do through dovetails with the 1/2-inch router bit, which is what this comes with. Oh, where's the one it comes with? I think this might be the one it comes with. You get a 1/2-inch router bit. So it's, find the lens here. It is 1/2 inch across the points and 1/2 inch deep. Now, if you're trying to use that when you cut dovetails in 1/2-inch thick material, what you get is dovetails that do not fit. You have to hammer them down into place. And I'll explain why that is in a little bit. But basically, if you want to use this to cut through dovetails, I just think that's a no-go. You got half blinds, you got panels, and you got box joints. Does a decent job with all of these. There are, I think, better ways to cut box joints on the router. You can make a box joint jig specifically. That'll be quicker and easier than this, but this gets the job done. All right, let's talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly here. What I don't like about this jig, I can sum up in one word, really, it's fiddly to use. For instance, if you look at the depth gauge here, it racks right and left when it's loose. So when you're going to set it, you really have to make sure that it's square. See how easy that is to get it out of square? Not a big deal, but it makes it a little fiddly. Worse is the clamps you have here for clamping the wood pieces in. You've got these two clamps running into a single straight bar here. And if you get one ahead of the other, there's not really a whole lot of play in there. So this one starts to bind up. It's worse when you have a piece of wood in there. You don't actually have to go that far. But you can see this is getting to the point where it's almost impossible to turn because there's no play in there. It is much worse when you're trying to clamp a piece of wood in there. So you have to do them evenly. So you go like a turn, a turn, a turn, a turn, a turn, a turn. It gets the job done. It's not that it doesn't work. It does a fine job of clamping things in place, but it's kind of fiddly. Makes it a little bit harder to use. If you want to cut box joints, you have to eliminate those little rounds. So you have to stick a shim in here. So you're trying to stick your piece in here and stick a shim in there and hold everything in place while you clamp it down. It gets the job done. You know, for 45 bucks for one of these things, it's not really a complaint. It's not a deal breaker. Let's put it that way. It's made out of anodized aluminum. It's anodized, not painted. Everything seems to be cut really well. It feels really solid for what it is. And one of the things I really, really like about this tool, you can use it on the router table. And that makes things really, really nice. This is nice and sturdy to grab to. You've got all of the surface down here or along here as to register. So you're getting a lot of nice contact, so you keep everything straight. You move it in and out of the spots. It's really, the other one I have, the Harbor Freight one, can't do that. And I think it's a really nice feature on this. Unless you're working with really, really big panels in here, it's much easier to clamp the workpiece into the jig and then move the jig around instead of trying to clamp the workpiece to the table and stick the jig on the workpiece. Again, that goes back to that fiddly part that I was talking about earlier. Trying to use this on the bench with a handheld router, it's really fiddly. It's not as nice as I would like it to be. Using it on the router table, it's excellent. Another really nice thing about this is that you're not really constricted in size. You put your panel in here, it doesn't matter how wide it is, it can go all the way through. They give you this key here, an alignment tool, so you can align up the next jig, so you can line up the next dovetail. So if you have a panel that's wider than this, you cut the first set of tails, you shift it over, align it with the alignment tool, cut the next set of tails, and that can go on for 10 feet if you want. So that's a nice feature about this, is you can go wider. Again, it's a little bit fiddly, but it gets the job done. So I want to make a little step-by-step tutorial about how to use this tool because I found the directions a little confusing. So this is if you want to cut half-blind dovetails. Step number one, referencing this lowest edge here, set the depth gauge to the depth of your tails piece that you're using. Make sure it's square. You want to set to the depth or a little bit more than the depth. If you go a little bit more than the depth, you'll end up with your tails sitting a little proud like this, and you can trim and sand that down flush. If you go too short, if you set this thinner than your piece, then your tails piece will end up proud of the pins piece and you'll get that whole face to deal with. So you don't want to go under. But you do want to go over or at. And you can dial that in as much as you want. And there's just a couple little Allens here. Lock this down. Stick my hand right in front of the camera. That's step number one. Step number 2, you want to loosely clamp one of your pins pieces into the pin side. And then bring it around here and line it up. And we're going to set our router bit depth. Now, I don't know exactly why this is this way, but the higher you go with the router bit, the tighter the joint is, to the point where if you have the 1/2-inch bit, like I mentioned, this is 1/2-inch wide, 1/2-inch deep. If you use the 1/2-inch bit on a 1/2-inch piece, then the joint is going to be too tight and it won't go together unless you smash it and hammer it into place, like you can see I had to do with this. I'm assuming this has something to do with the geometry of both the jig and the dovetail bit, but if you come up too high, it's not going to go together. If you come down too low, I'm sorry, I keep hitting my camera. If you come down too low, then you're going to end up with joints that are sloppy and loose like this one is. I don't know if you can see that or not. You can see this is just like a, there we go. You can see there's a ton of motion in there. So you're really just going to have to trial and error this with some scraps. Go up, go down until you've got it to where you think it's a decent level that you're going to get a nice tight joint, but not too tight of a joint. Step 3, you're just going to clamp one of your tails pieces into this side. You can center your workpiece on this center pin here. That way you'll know you have exactly the same number of pins on each side of the center. Sorry, center it on this finger. So you'll have an even number of tails on either side. That's purely an aesthetic thing. If you want to mess around, try setting it off to one side or setting it off to the other side. Mess around with some scraps. That's the best way you're going to figure it out. But you can center it here, and from there, you just cut your tails. All of the usual issues with potential tear out is something you want to keep in mind. If you want to make sure to avoid tear out, you can always put a sacrificial piece behind here. But there you go. There's our tails. So when we do the pins, we're going to reverse this. The inside is, or the outside is going to go forward. The inside is going to go in. Now, the way we do this alignment, using the top part of the depth gauge as an alignment gauge, you take the pins with the rounded side of the pins facing that way, drop them right in there, and then align your, sorry, those are the tails. I keep mixing up tails and pins. So you want to take the tails with the rounded part of the tail facing that way, and then you're going to align your pins board to that as best that you can. You can see there I'm fighting with those screws. That's what I talked about with that. There we go. That's better. You got to kind of go like a turn, a turn, a turn, a turn to snug that all down. It's not the end of the world. For a $45 tool, I am not going to complain. All right, now, you want to make sure you're not cutting this like this. You need to flip it like that. And you're going to be cutting your pins like this, as I've chewed into that already. All right. Let's cut our pins. I've done all of this correctly. We should have a working dovetail joint now. Let's see if I screwed something up. Bloop. Nope. A little snug on the side here. Let me just tap that in with the mallet on. Looks like I didn't cut that one quite as cleanly as I should have. But there we are. Half-blind dovetail joint. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed the video, do all the YouTube things, like, share, subscribe, all that stuff. And I'll see you in the next video. I have no idea what it's going to be or when it's going to come out.